everyone. So I've had some requests to do some mind maps to try and put the auditing concepts together. So I'm going to pick an audit concept and then we're going to move out from there. So let's start with the concept of audit evidence. And I've picked evidence, but you could start with anything that we've covered in the first 6 weeks. All right. So I'm just going to talk aloud and I'm going to talk through my thought processes on how I can link audit evidence to our other topics. Okay, so here we go. Audit evidence. I need audit evidence to be able to generate my opinion. And I know that my opinion, depending on the type of assurance I'm going to give, and depending on the type of engagement, I could have reasonable or limited. Alright, so to determine what type of engagement I've got, I need to make sure I refer to my engagement letter. Because my engagement letter will set out whether I'm doing an audit or a review. And we know that in our subject, we're going to focus on doing the audit rather than the review. Now, before I sign my engagement letter, I need to make sure that I investigate the client. So I need to, before I do that, I need to understand the client to figure out whether they're a good fit, what the sort of risks might be, and then I also need to determine whether I have the technical skills. All right, so I need to make sure I have technical skills and competence. And I also need to check, before I have signed an engagement letter, whether I am independent. Part of those come out from APES 110 as well as our Corporations Act. Okay, so we need to understand the client to be able to figure out the type of engagement so that I can give the right audit opinion. I also have to provide audit evidence to give that opinion. Now, to be able to generate audit evidence, I need to use audit procedures. So audit evidence comes from audit procedures. And I know I've got my list. I've got my vouching, tracing, recalculating, etc. And I just don't do procedures. I also need to think about, when I do those procedures, what sort of audit strategy. I'm going to implement. So am I following a controls or a compliance-based approach? Now, to be able to use my audit strategy, or to know what sort of audit strategy, I'm going to need my audit risk model. All right, remember my audit risk model is DR equals AR divided by IR times CR. And to be able to do the audit risk model, I need 2 things. First, I need the inherent risks. And I also need to identify the control risks. All right, and to be able to identify both of those, the inherent risks, I also need to be able to understand the client. And I also need to consider also the possibility of fraud. Alright, and then for my control risks, I also need to understand the client, but I need to understand the internal control structure. Alright, and the internal control structure is comprised of 5 components, which is my control environment, risk assessment, control activities, information systems, and communication and monitoring. Okay, so I've got my audit risk model, my risks, will feed into my audit strategy and my audit procedures. And now when I'm collecting audit evidence, I also need to make sure to determine whether I have the opinion about whether it is true and fair, because that's the real question. I need my audit evidence. I also need to understand my accounting standards. Alright, because my accounting standards will help me determine whether that's true and fair or not. And then I also need to make sure that I'm following the assertions. Alright, because to determine whether something is true and fair, I do need to make sure that I've collected evidence on all of the assertions. Alright, and that will also link through to the inherent risks that I identified. So my inherent risks will link through to my assertions and also link through to my audit evidence. Okay, my accounting standards will link through to my opinion. Okay, all right. Now, what else have we covered during the term? We've covered assertions, strategy. All right. Now, in the early weeks of the term, we also looked at the objectives of the audit and about giving an opinion. When I think about my opinion and whether my financial statements are true and fair, I'm not looking for all errors. I'm only looking for material misstatements. Alright. And those misstatements could be fraud. Alright, so those could be intentional. Which is linked to my possibilities of fraud over here. Or it could be mistakes or errors. Okay. Now, regardless, the key to evaluating my audit evidence, as well as looking at the assertions, is going to be the idea of materiality. Alright, so materiality will help me identify what material misstatements from my audit evidence and my audit opinion. And to figure out how much materiality should be, I need to understand the client, because remember, I need to choose an appropriate base. So materiality has understanding the client feeding into it. And remember, where there is a greater level of risk, inherent or control risk, I need to adjust my materiality as well. So I need a line from over here going through there, and control risk, let's go around the outside. Okay, now I also need to think about, this comes out of my engagement letter, my legal liability. Alright, and so that comes down to a couple of different issues. Remember, we've got sources of law, so we've got sources of legal liability. Okay, so we have our sources of legal liability, and there are 3. Alright, so remember there's the case, or, so let's see if I can fit this out. Contract law, regulation like the Corporations Act, and then common law, which comes down to the tort of negligence. Alright, and that's the trickiest one. I suppose with the tort of negligence, we need to figure out, the key question is, who do we owe a duty of care to? Alright, so that will be, okay, so the tort of negligence, making sure that we're using our technical seals of competence will come in there, and independence will feed into the regulation. I won't draw a line over there, but legal liability becomes really important because our opinion is something that creates legal liability amongst others. Now, of course, if we haven't done parts of our audit correctly, we haven't followed our auditing standards, then that does expose us to greater legal liability. Now, also linked to legal liability is our audit risk model and our concept of audit risk, because the greater the level of audit risk we take, the greater the exposure to legal liability we have. So normally in the legal, in our audit risk model, it's low. But let me draw a line between legal liability and the audit risk model. Alright, so that's one example of how I can link all of the concepts that we've done throughout the term, starting with the term audit evidence. But you could pick any of these, alright? And once you've done your diagram, you can always go through our topic list and see if we've checked everything off. Another good task you could try and do is try and link the auditing standards to each of these items here. So audit evidence is ASA 500, types of engagements and the level of assurance comes out of ASA 200, the engagement letter is ASA 210, audit procedures are contained in 500, considering fraud is in 240, understanding the client is in 315, responding to our audit risk model and developing and responding to risks is 330, our assertions come in 315A111, materiality is in ASA 320, fraud again covered in 240, opinions in 700, 705, 706. Legal liability obviously is our case law, so there's not any standards there. Independence comes in our engagement letter and in quality control, so 210, 220. Technical skills and competence is quality control, internal control structure, and control risks is 315. Same with the inherent risks and the audit risk model. The accounting standards will come in 200 because they are our appropriate standards that we use. So that's auditing in a nutshell. Have a go at it yourself. Compare your diagrams with friends. No two are going to be the same depending on what we start with and our own thought processes. So good luck everybody for the mid-semester exam.